It began with the first call at exactly midnight. The sharp trill of Sarah's phone shattered the silence of her small apartment. She jolted awake, her heart hammering in her chest. Fumbling for the phone, she squinted at the screen. The number was hidden, an ominous unknown caller glaring back at her. Curiosity and irritation warred within her. She swiped to answer. "Hello," she croaked, her voice groggy. For a moment, only static filled her ear. Then, a rasping voice slithered through the line, just above a whisper. "I see you." A cold chill crept over her skin, but she forced a laugh, shaking off the discomfort. Probably some prankster, a bored creep with nothing better to do. Rolling her eyes, she hung up and buried herself under the covers. The next morning, the call was nothing more than a strange memory, quickly shrugged off as she went about her day. But that night, at exactly midnight, the phone rang again. The same hidden number, the same cold dread pooling in her stomach. She answered, her voice sharper this time. "Who is this?" The voice rasped, closer now, almost intimate. "I'm coming for you." The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floor. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She grabbed the phone, slammed it onto the nightstand, and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with fear. Sleep never came. By the third night, her nerves were raw. Midnight struck, and the phone rang like a death knell. Her hand trembled as she answered. Silence followed by a low, menacing chuckle. "Are you scared yet, Sarah?" She hung up, bile rising in her throat. Her walls felt like they were closing in, her once cozy apartment now a prison. Exhaustion gnawed at her sanity. She hadn't slept in days, haunted by the calls that came like clockwork. Desperate, she confided in her friend Mark. His broad shoulders and easy smile should have made her feel safe. "It's just some jerk with too much time on their hands," he shrugged. "They'll get bored and stop." She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the caller wouldn't stop. Not until they got what they wanted. The next day, Sarah changed her number. The relief was instantaneous. That night she fell into bed, exhausted but hopeful. No call disturbed the midnight hour. For the first time in days, she slept. A week passed. The terror began to fade into a bad memory, something she'd recount with a shudder but ultimately dismiss. Life felt normal again. Then on the seventh night, her phone buzzed. Unknown caller. Her blood froze. She stared at the screen, dread curling around her like smoke. The phone rang again, a piercing, relentless sound. Hands shaking, she picked it up and pressed it to her ear, unable to stop herself. Static. Then that dreadful rasp, "You can't hide from me." She dropped the phone as though it had burned her. Tears welled in her eyes, her breath came in ragged bursts. She locked every door, checked every window. Shadows seemed to stretch and bend outside, silhouettes of twisted figures just out of reach. Every rustling branch, every creaking floorboard felt like a whisper of imminent doom. The game of cat and mouse was no longer a game. It was a hunt, and she was the prey. By the seventh night, the walls of her apartment felt suffocating. Paranoia had seeped into every corner of her mind. She barely recognized herself in the mirror, hollow-eyed, pale, a ghost of the woman she had been. As midnight approached, she sat on the edge of her bed, the phone clutched tightly in her hands. Her heart drummed a frantic rhythm in her chest. When the phone rang, she answered before the first ring even ended. Her voice trembled. "What do you want?" For a long moment, there was nothing but static. Then the voice, colder than ever, whispered one word. "You." A cruel, hollow laughter erupted from the other end of the line, drilling into her brain like nails. The laughter didn't stop, but then, it wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was coming from behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. A shadow stretched across the wall in front of her, growing larger, more solid. She turned her head slowly, as though trapped in a nightmare. The front door stood wide open, a cold breeze drifting through, and standing in the doorway, illuminated by the dim glow of the hallway light, was Mark. His smile was wrong, too wide, too gleeful. His eyes gleamed with a darkness she'd never seen before. "You thought I'd let you escape that easily?" he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. Her legs refused to move. Her mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something, but terror held her in place. Mark stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a final echoing thud. The air grew colder. The shadows in the room seemed to swell, wrapping around them like a shroud. His grin widened, the darkness in his eyes spilling out, infecting the very air. "You really should have listened," he whispered, reaching out a hand. She backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were too close. The shadows were too deep. And in that moment, she realized the truth. The horror hadn't just begun tonight. It had begun the moment she trusted him. The phone in her hand crackled to life one last time. The raspy voice whispered, now in perfect harmony with Mark's. "The game is just beginning." The light overhead flickered and went out, and Sarah's screams dissolved into the darkness.